Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into AWS Identity and Access Management,
IAM.
IAM, better known as IAM,
Yeah.
and you want to get a handle on this.
hmm
It can feel kind of complex, right?
It can. A lot of people think of it as just a techie thing,
Right.
but it's way more fundamental than that.
Okay.
It's really the control center for who can do what in your AWS world.
Exactly. And you send over a bunch of articles and research, and we're going to help unpack it all today.
Awesome.
What's fascinating to me is new AWS users start with zero access,
Right.
not even login access. It's like they're standing outside a locked building with no key.
That's right. It all comes down to the principle of least privilege,
Okay.
which is a fancy way of saying you only grant access to what's absolutely necessary.
Okay, I'm already seeing a theme here. So to understand IAM, what are the core pieces we need to know about?
So you've got four main components: users, groups, roles, and policies.
Okay.
Each of these plays a crucial role in building a secure and well-managed AWS environment.
All right, so let's start with users. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, it is on the surface.
Okay.
Each user represents a person or even an application that needs access to AWS.
hmm
They have a username and password, and critically, a set of permissions that define what they can and cannot do.
And that brings us to the infamous root user, which I know we need to talk about.
Yes.
From what I've read, this is something you want to handle with extreme caution.
Absolutely. The root user is like the master key to your entire AWS account. It's created when you first sign up for AWS, and it has unlimited power.
So if someone gets their hands on the root user credentials, they basically own your entire AWS setup.
It's that serious.
Wow.
That's why one of the most fundamental IAM best practices
Yeah.
is to lock away your root user credentials and never use them for everyday tasks.
Okay, so treat them like they're made of solid gold and lock them in a vault. But if we're not using the root user for daily tasks, what's the alternative?
That's where IAM users come in. You create individual IAM users for each person or application that needs access to your AWS resources.
Okay, so instead of sharing the master key, everyone gets their own key that only unlocks the specific doors they need to access?
Exactly. And, that 5,000 user limit you pointed out in the research.
Yeah.
Well, it might seem like a lot. Large organizations, especially those dealing with temporary workforce fluctuations, need to think strategically about user management.
Okay.
It highlights the need for robust automation and lifecycle management processes for IAM users.
Interesting. It's one of those things you might not consider until you hit that limit, right?
Exactly.
So we have users and we keep the root user locked away safe and sound. What about groups?
Groups make managing permissions much more efficient.
Okay.
Instead of assigning permissions to individual users one by one, which can become a nightmare, you can create groups based on job functions or tasks.
So you'd have a group for developers who need access to code repositories and a group for marketing who need access to analytics data.
Precisely, you assign permissions to the group, and then any user belonging to that group inherits those permissions.
Gotcha.
It makes things much cleaner and easier to manage, especially as your AWS environment grows.
It's like having preset access badges for different departments in a company.
Yeah.
Now, what about roles? I know they can be a bit confusing.
Yeah.
But I also read they're really powerful.
Roles are essentially temporary sets of permissions that a user or even an AWS service can assume.
Okay.
Think of it like borrowing someone's access card for a specific purpose and a limited time.
Okay, so it's not giving them permanent access. It's more like lending them a key that only works for certain areas and only for a specific period.
That's a great way to think about it.
Okay.
Roles are really useful for scenarios where you need to grant temporary access maybe to a contractor or to an application running on an EC2 instance,
Okay.
which is basically a virtual server in the AWS cloud.
Got it. EC2 instance virtual server, basically the computer your application lives on in AWS.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you could give someone temporary access to an EC2 instance to perform maintenance or updates without giving them permanent keys to the kingdom.
Exactly.
And what's particularly interesting about roles is that an EC2 instance can only be assigned one role at a time.
Okay.
This ensures that the instance operates with a clear and defined set of permissions, reducing the risk of unintended access or actions.
One role at a time, so no juggling multiple hats for these EC2 instances. So we've got users groups to organize them and roles to grant temporary access. What's the missing piece here?
Policies think of policies as the rules of the game.
Okay.
They define what actions are allowed or denied for a user group or role. They're written in a language called JSON,
JSON.
which stands for JavaScript Object Notation.
I've seen that term thrown around a lot, but to be honest, it kind of makes my eyes glaze over. Can
Yeah.
you break it down a bit further?
Imagine it as a set of instructions written in a very specific format using key value pairs.
Okay.
Think of it like a recipe where you have the ingredient, the key, and the amount of the value.
Okay, that makes it a little less intimidating.
Good.
So these policies, these JSON recipes are basically saying this user can do this, but they can't do that.
Precisely. And here's the crucial part. By default, everything is denied in AWS.
Whoa, really?
You have to explicitly grant access for every single action.
So it's not like starting with full access and then taking away permissions. It's the complete opposite.
That's right. It's a security-first approach.
Okay.
You start with a clean slate, and then you carefully add permissions as needed.
I like that.
And to make things even more secure, there's a rule that the most restrictive policy always wins.
So if a user is subject to multiple policies, the one with the least amount of access will be the one that takes effect.
Exactly. It's all about minimizing risk and
Yeah.
ensuring that users have the absolute minimum permissions necessary to do their jobs.
Okay.
And to help you test and validate these policies, AWS provides a really cool tool called the IAM Policy Simulator.
Oh, yeah, I read about that. So before you unleash a policy on your entire AWS environment, you can run it through this simulator and see exactly how it will behave.
Precisely, you can test different scenarios, see what actions are allowed or denied, and make sure the policy is working exactly as intended.
It's like having a practice run before the big show.
Exactly.
I love that. So we've covered users, groups, roles, and policies. Are we IAM experts now?
We've definitely got a solid foundation.
Okay.
But there's one more important piece of the IAM puzzle to explore. The AWS Security Token Service, or STS.
STS sounds intriguing. What's that all about?
Think of STS as the system for issuing temporary access passes to your AWS resources.
Okay.
Instead of giving someone permanent credentials, STS allows you to create temporary limited privilege credentials.
Okay, so instead of giving someone the master key to the building STS, lets you hand out temporary key cards that expire after a set amount of time.
A perfect analogy.
I like that. Welcome back to the deep dive. Last time we took a deep dive into the core components of AWS identity and access management, users, groups, roles, and policies, and established that, even though it sounds complex, it's really all about controlling who has access to what within your AWS environment.
Exactly. It's like building a secure house with multiple layers of locks and keys, each serving a specific purpose.
And right before the break, we were starting to talk about the AWS Security Token Service, or STS.
Yes.
What makes this so important in the grand scheme of IAM?
So STS is all about temporary security credentials.
Okay.
Instead of giving someone the permanent keys to your AWS castle, you can use STS to issue temporary access passes that expire after a set amount of time.
So it's like giving someone a guest pass to your AWS account that automatically deactivates after a certain period.
Precisely. And this approach has some significant security advantages.
Okay.
For starters, you're not embedding long-term credentials into your applications, which greatly reduces the risk of those credentials being compromised.
That makes sense. If someone gets their hands on a temporary credential, the damage they can do is limited because those credentials will expire soon anyway.
Exactly. And the beauty of STS is that those temporary credentials expire automatically, so you don't have to worry about manually revoking them.
Okay.
It's like a self-destructing message in a spy movie.
I love those spy movie analogies. It definitely makes these concepts easier to grasp.
Good.
So who are these temporary credentials typically issued to?
So STS handles three main sources of users.
Okay.
First, you have federation, which is often used with systems like Active Directory,
Okay.
which is commonly used for managing users and computers within a corporate network. It allows users to sign in using their existing corporate credentials without needing a separate IAM user account.
So instead of having to create and manage separate AWS credentials for every employee, they can just use their existing work login to access the AWS resources they need.
That's right. It streamlines the process and makes things easier for both users and administrators.
Okay.
Then you have federation with mobile apps,
Okay.
which is what you see when you encounter those login with Google or login with Facebook buttons.
Ah, so that's how those work behind the scenes. It's using STS to grant temporary access to the app using my existing social media credentials.
Exactly. It's a convenient way for users to access applications without having to create yet another username and password combination.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the third source of users for STS?
The third source is cross-account access.
Okay.
This allows users from one AWS account to access resources in another AWS account. Again, without needing to create individual IAM users in the second account.
So if two companies are collaborating on a project, They can use STS to grant each other's employees limited access to specific resources in their respective AWS accounts.
Precisely. It's a much more secure and efficient way to manage access in those collaborative scenarios.
Got it. So STS is like this powerful tool that adds a layer of flexibility and security on top of the core IAM components we talked about earlier.
Mhm.
But all of this talk about security and permissions, it makes me wonder, what are some common mistakes people make with IAM and how can we avoid them?
That's a great question.
Hmm.
One of the biggest mistakes I see is people not taking the root user seriously enough.
Yeah.
They either use it for day-to-day tasks or they don't properly secure the credentials.
It's like using the master key to your house to open every single door, including the garden shed. Not a good idea.
Not at all. Always create individual IAM users for each person or application that needs access, and only use the root user for very specific, high-level administrative tasks.
Okay, so lock away the root user check. What else should we watch out for?
Another common mistake is over-granting permissions.
Okay.
People often grant more access than is necessary just to be on the safe side.
It's like giving everyone in the office a key to the executive washroom, just in case.
Exactly. Always adhere to the principle of least privilege. Only grant the bare minimum permissions required for a user or role to perform their specific tasks.
Right.
And this might seem obvious, but enable multi-factor authentication, or MFA, for all users.
Yeah.
It adds an extra layer of security that can prevent unauthorized access even if a password is compromised.
MFA is a must-have these days. It's like having a security guard check your ID before letting you into the building, even if you have the key.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And speaking of security, never embed long-term credentials directly into your applications.
Okay.
Always use roles for applications that run on EC2 instances, and consider using temporary credentials from STS whenever possible.
Got it. Use roles for applications and leverage STS for temporary access. What else should we keep in mind?
Don't forget about groups. They're an incredibly powerful tool for managing permissions efficiently.
Right.
Group users, based on their job functions or the tasks they need to perform, and then assign permissions to the groups rather than to individual users.
It's all about keeping things organized and manageable, especially as your AWS environment grows. Any other best practices we should know about?
Regularly rotate your credentials. Don't let passwords sit there for months or years. Remove any unnecessary credentials and keep an eye on activity in your AWS account.
Okay.
Regularly review logs and set up alerts so you're immediately notified of any suspicious behavior.
So don't just set it and forget it regularly. Check in and make sure everything is running smoothly and securely.
Exactly.
These are all great tips for keeping our AWS environments secure. But I'm curious, what are some real-world examples of how people are actually using IAM in their organizations?
That's a great question. IAM is used in a wide variety of ways, and its applications are constantly evolving. For example, a software development company might use IAM to control access to their code repositories, build systems, and deployment pipelines.
So developers can only access the code they need to work on, and only authorized personnel can deploy new code to production environments.
Exactly. Another example might be a healthcare organization using IAM to secure patient data.
Okay.
They might use roles to grant doctors and nurses temporary access to specific patient records, ensuring that only authorized personnel can view sensitive medical information.
That makes sense. It's all about protecting sensitive data and making sure it's only accessed by those who absolutely need to see it.
And it's not just about restricting access. IAM can also be used to enable collaboration and data sharing in a secure way.
Okay.
For instance, a financial institution might use cross-account access to allow their analysts to access market data from a third-party provider without having to create individual IAM users in the provider's account.
So they can get the information they need without compromising the security of either organization's AWS environment. It sounds like IAM is not just about locking things down, it's also about enabling people to do their jobs more effectively and collaborate more securely.
That's a great way to put it. IAM is a powerful tool that can be used to enhance security, enable collaboration, and streamline workflows within your AWS environment.
This is all incredibly insightful, but we've been focusing so much on AWS. I have to ask, are these IAM concepts relevant outside of the cloud?
That's a fascinating question, and the answer might surprise you.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
The principles behind IAM, particularly the principle of least privilege, have applications that extend far beyond the realm of AWS and cloud computing.
So even if I'm not a techie working in the cloud, these concepts are still relevant to my everyday life.
Absolutely. Think about it. How many apps on your smartphone have access to your location, your contacts, your camera, your microphone? Do they all really need that level of access?
And now that you mention it, probably not. I rarely use half of those apps, and I certainly don't remember granting them permission to access all that stuff.
Exactly. And that's where the principle of least privilege comes in.
Okay.
By applying this principle to your own digital life, you can reduce your attack surface and make yourself a much harder target for cybercriminals.
So just like we create individual IAM users with specific permissions in AWS, we should be thinking about the permissions we grant to apps on our phones, on our computers, and even on our social media accounts.
Exactly. It's all about being mindful of what access you're granting and being proactive about minimizing your risk.
That's a really powerful takeaway. It sounds like IAM is not just a set of technical tools, it's a mindset, a way of thinking about security that can be applied to all aspects of our digital lives.
That's a great way to put it. It's about taking control of your own security and making informed decisions about who and what have access to your data and your devices.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've covered so much ground from the core components of IAM to the power of STS, and we've even explored how these concepts can be applied outside of AWS to make our digital lives more secure.
It's been a pleasure, and I hope our listener feels empowered to take control of their AWS security and apply these principles to their own digital world.
We've got one more part to go in this deep dive, so stay with us as we wrap things up with some key takeaways and some thought-provoking questions to ponder. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into AWS identity and access management.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the nuts and bolts of users, groups, roles, and policies to the power of temporary security credentials with STS.
Right.
But what does it all really mean?
It means that IAM is about so much more than just ticking boxes for compliance or setting up a bunch of technical configurations. It's about establishing a security mindset, both within your AWS environment and in your own digital life.
And what stood out to me was that it's not just about locking everything down and restricting access, it's also about enabling people to do their jobs effectively and collaborate securely.
Exactly. Think about those real-world examples we discussed.
Yeah.
Development teams using IAM to streamline their workflows. Healthcare organizations protecting sensitive patient data.
Right.
Financial institutions enabling secure data sharing between partners. It's all about finding that balance between security and usability.
Right. It's like designing a building that is both secure and welcoming with the right levels of access for different types of visitors.
A perfect analogy. And what I find particularly fascinating is how the principle of least privilege, which is at the heart of IAM, can be applied so broadly.
Yeah.
We've talked about AWS, but these concepts are relevant to our personal devices, our social media accounts, our online banking,
Right.
virtually every aspect of our digital lives.
It's a powerful idea, isn't it? Thinking critically about what access we grant, not just in the cloud, but in every corner of our digital world.
It is. And it's something we should all be thinking about, not just IT professionals or security experts.
Yeah.
It's about taking ownership of our own security and making informed decisions about what data we share and who we trust with it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind?
First and foremost, IAM is not just a technical concept, it's a mindset.
Okay.
It's about understanding that security is not a one-time setup. It's an ongoing process that requires vigilance and attention to detail.
Right. It's like staying healthy. It's not enough to just eat a salad once a month. You need to make healthy choices consistently over time.
Exactly. Second, embrace the principle of least privilege. Challenge yourself to think critically about what access you're granting, whether it's to an AWS resource, a mobile app, or a social media platform.
Always ask yourself, does this really need access to all of this?
Precisely, and finally, don't be afraid to ask questions and seek guidance. There are tons of resources available online, and the AWS community is incredibly helpful and supportive.
The internet is our friend. There's no shame in reaching out for help or doing some extra research to make sure you're doing things right.
Absolutely. Security is a journey, not a destination.
This has been an amazing deep dive. We've learned so much about IAM, and I think we've all gained a new appreciation for how important it is, not just in the cloud, but in our everyday digital lives.
It's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you.
And a big thank you to our listener for joining us on this deep dive into AWS identity and access management. We hope you feel empowered to take control of your AWS security and apply these principles to make your own digital life more secure. Until next time, stay curious, stay secure, and keep on learning.